Not every turning point in history announces itself. Some begin with nothing more than a quiet decision. In 1799, a 30-year-old soldier sat down and decided that France was his. Not by birthright or inheritance, but through sheer force of will and ruthless ambition. Within 5 years, half of Europe would fall under his control. And after a decade and a half of war, the rest of Europe would spend everything it had trying to stop him. This is the story of one of the most influential men in human history, and how one soldier from a forgotten island reshaped history forever. It all began on a small Mediterranean island, Corsica. In 1769, Corsica had only just become a part of France, sold by the Republic of Genoa to France the year before Napoleon was born. The people there spoke Italian. They had their own culture, their own pride, and honestly, they were not very happy about suddenly being French. Into this world, on August 15, 1769, a boy named Napoleon Bonaparte was born. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer from a modest noble family. Not rich, not powerful, just comfortable enough. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a fierce, disciplined woman who raised 8 children with very little and somehow made it look manageable. Napoleon was the second child to survive. From the beginning, he was small, sharp, and had a temper, and above all, a voracious reader who read everything he could get his hands on. The family did not have much, but Carlo was smart. He knew France had doors that Corsica did not, so he worked hard to get his children French citizenship and the nobility papers that came with it. And it eventually paid off. In 1778, when Napoleon was just 9 years old, he left Corsica for France. He barely spoke French at the time and didn't know anyone. But he was going to school with children from some of the most powerful families in Europe. The school was a military preparatory academy in Brienne, a small town in northeastern France. And Napoleon hated it. Not the learning. He loved learning. But hated the other boys who constantly made fun of his accent and laughed at his name. They called him the foreigner, the little Italian. He got into fights. He was stubborn and hot-tempered, and he pushed back against anyone who looked down on him. But alone in his room, he read mathematics, history, military campaigns, geography. He consumed it all. One teacher later said that this boy had a fire in him that was difficult to describe. You could either be burned by it or warmed by it, but you could not ignore it. At 15, Napoleon was admitted to the elite military academy in Paris. It was the best military school in France. Boys who graduated from there became officers. He completed the 2-year program in 1 year. By 1785, at 16 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the French artillery. He had gone from a nobody on an island no one cared about to a French military officer before most boys his age had figured out what they wanted to do with their lives. But the real story was just getting started. France in the late 1780s was a country ready to explode. The common people were starving. Bread prices had gone through the roof. The king, Louis XVI, was drowning in debt from financing wars, including the American Revolution. While the elite citizens and the church paid almost no taxes, the ordinary French citizen paid for everything and got almost nothing in return. Finally, in 1789, the explosion happened. The French Revolution, people rose up, and the king was arrested. The old world was torn down, and a new one was being built, violently, messily, with a lot of blood. Napoleon watched all of this with fascination. He was a young officer from a minor noble family, which meant he was in a strange middle position. Too noble for the peasants, not noble enough for the old aristocracy. But when the revolution came and the old aristocratic officers fled France by the thousands, Suddenly, there were empty positions everywhere, and Napoleon was exactly the kind of ambitious, skilled, driven young man who knew how to fill a vacuum. His first real moment came in 1793 at a port city called Toulon. Royalist rebels had taken over the city and invited British and Spanish forces in to help them hold it against the French Republic. It was a major crisis. Toulon was one of France's most important naval ports. The French artillery commander was wounded. Napoleon, a 24-year-old captain at the time, stepped in. He immediately saw what no one else had seen. There was a fort on a hill that overlooked the entire harbor. Take that fort, and you could make the harbor impossible for enemy ships to use. Force the ships out, and the city would have to surrender. His commanders thought it was too risky. Napoleon pushed. He argued. He practically begged. Eventually, they let him try. He took the fort. The British ships had no choice but to sail away. Toulon fell to the Republic within days, and at just 24 years old, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general overnight. But France during the Revolution was not a stable place to build a career. Governments rose and fell. Men who were heroes 1 month were sent to the guillotine the next. Napoleon navigated all of it carefully, sometimes dangerously close to falling out of favor. In 1795, he was in Paris, somewhat stuck, when the government faced an armed revolt from royalist mobs in the streets. The commander responsible for defending the government froze. Napoleon stepped in again. He loaded cannons with grapeshot, a kind of ammunition that spreads on impact, and turned them directly on the charging crowds. It was brutal. It was effective. The revolt was crushed in minutes. Napoleon later called it, without any emotion, a whiff of grapeshot. He had just become the savior of the French Republic, and at 26 years old, a new phase of his life was about to begin. Around this same time, Napoleon met Josephine. Her real name was Marie-Rose Détachée de la Pagerie, but everyone called her Josephine. She was a widow, a Creole woman from the island of Martinique, and was 6 years older than Napoleon. Her first husband had been executed during the Revolution. She had 2 children. Creole was a beautiful, charming woman and deeply connected to Parisian high society. Napoleon couldn't help but fell completely and helplessly in love with her. He wrote her letters, long, aching, almost embarrassing letters. He told her she was everything he thought about. He told her the image of her smile was the only thing that got him through difficult days. Josephine, to be honest, did not feel quite the same way at first. She liked him. She respected his ambition. But the towering emotional intensity he brought to the relationship was a lot to handle. They got married in March 1796. And after 2 days of their wedding ceremony, Napoleon left for Italy. The Italian campaign was supposed to be a secondary operation. France was fighting Austria and its allies across multiple fronts, and Italy was considered the least important theatre. Napoleon had other ideas. He took command of the army of Italy, which was exhausted, underpaid, and underfed. He gave them a speech that has been remembered for over 200 years. He told them that they stood on the edge of the most fertile plains in the world, that glory and riches were waiting for them, that he would lead them there, and he did exactly that. In a single campaign, lasting just over a year, Napoleon defeated 4 separate Austrian armies. He fought 18 battles and won them all. He crossed mountain passes that military experts said were impassable. He moved faster than anyone thought an army could move, striking before the enemy could regroup. By 1797, Austria was asking for peace. Napoleon, the 27-year-old general from Corsica, personally negotiated the Treaty of Campo Formio with one of the most powerful empires in Europe. He did not wait for politicians in Paris to tell him what terms to offer. He just made the deal himself. France was stunned. Europe was stunned. Who was this man? Back in Paris, Napoleon was famous. dangerously famous. The French government, known as the Directory, was worried about him. A popular general with an army loyal to him personally was not exactly a comfortable thing to have sitting in your capital city. Napoleon understood this perfectly, so in 1798 he proposed an expedition to Egypt. The logic was ambitious. Egypt was controlled by the Ottoman Empire and was a key point on trade routes to British India. If France could take Egypt, it could threaten British power in the East. The Directory agreed, mostly because they were happy to have Napoleon far away. He sailed with a massive force, 40,000 soldiers, and, in one of the more unusual decisions in military history, 167 scientists, artists, and scholars. Napoleon genuinely believed that wherever he went, civilization should follow. The military campaign started brilliantly. He defeated the Mamluk cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids. He took Cairo. He reportedly told his soldiers, "From the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries of history look down upon you." Whether he actually said it or not, it does not matter. The point is that when Napoleon spoke, the world leaned in. But then things started to fall apart. The British Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay and destroyed it almost completely in the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon's army was now trapped in Egypt. They could not get supplies and could not easily go home. A campaign into Ottoman Syria failed. Disease tore through his troops. Napoleon himself almost died of plague. And in Paris, things were getting worse. The Directory was collapsing. France was losing on multiple military fronts. The situation back home was desperate. Napoleon left Egypt secretly in August 1799, slipping through the British naval blockade and sailing back to France. He left his army behind. It is one of the darker facts about Napoleon. The men who followed him into the desert were abandoned, but he told himself and them that France needed him more. When Napoleon arrived back in France, he was greeted as a hero. People had no idea how badly Egypt had gone. The news was controlled. What they knew was that the best general was home, and France was in trouble. Napoleon moved quickly. On November 9, 1799, known in the French revolutionary calendar as 18 Brumaire, he and his allies staged a coup. It was not perfectly smooth. When he walked into the council chamber to deliver a prepared speech, the delegates shouted him down. Someone actually grabbed him by the collar, and he was escorted out looking rattled. His brother Lucien, who was president of the council, saved the day by convincing the soldiers outside that a foreign plot was unfolding inside. The soldiers believed it. The council was dissolved at bayonet point, and Napoleon Bonaparte was installed as first consul of France. In simple terms, he was now the ruler of the country. He was 30 years old. What followed was one of the most remarkable periods of governance in modern history. Napoleon was not just a soldier, he was a builder. He worked 16 to 18 hours a day, reorganizing France from the ground up. He created the Banque de France, which stabilized the economy, built roads and bridges and canals across the country. He created the lycée system, a national network of secondary schools, because he genuinely believed an educated population was a strong population. He reformed the legal system from scratch. The old French law was a confusing mess of regional codes and medieval rules that nobody fully understood. Napoleon replaced it with a single, clear, logical system that treated all male citizens as equal before the law, protected property rights, and guaranteed religious freedom. That system was called the Napoleonic Code. It is still the foundation of law in France today. And not just France. Louisiana in the United States, Quebec in Canada, large parts of Latin America, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands. Dozens of countries around the world still use laws that trace directly back to what Napoleon built. He also ended the religious conflict that had been tearing France apart since the Revolution. by negotiating a peace deal with the Catholic Church called the Concordat of 1801. Enemies became at least temporary allies. France breathed, and the French people adored him. On December 2nd, 1804, in a ceremony that people described as the most spectacular event they had ever witnessed, Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned Emperor of the French. The Pope himself, Pius VII, had travelled from Rome for the occasion. But in a moment that became one of the most famous images in history. When the time came for the Pope to place the crown on Napoleon's head, Napoleon took it from him and crowned himself. He then took a second crown and placed it on Josephine's head. The message was not subtle. He did not need the Church's blessing to rule. His authority came from himself, from his achievements, from the will of the French people. He was emperor. Europe took notice. The major European powers, Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, had been watching Napoleon's rise with growing alarm. They had already fought him and lost. They knew he was dangerous. But being dangerous did not stop them from trying again. Coalition after coalition formed against France, and Napoleon, with a consistency that still astonishes military historians, broke them. In December 1805, at the Battle of Austerlitz, in what is now the Czech Republic, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Austria and Russia, led by Emperors Francis II and Alexander I personally. He was outnumbered. He deliberately weakened his right flank to make it look like an invitation. The Allied commanders took the bait. They sent their best troops to crush what they thought was a collapsing French position. Napoleon then hit their now unprotected center with everything he had. The Allied army was split in two and destroyed within 4 hours. Austerlitz is still studied in military academies around the world as one of the most perfect battles ever fought. Austria immediately sued for peace. The Holy Roman Empire, a political structure that had existed in various forms for 1,000 years, was dissolved. Napoleon replaced it with what he called the Confederation of the Rhine, a group of German states under French influence. This man was rewriting the map of Europe, and nobody could stop him. By 1810, Napoleon's empire was the largest Europe had seen since ancient Rome. France controlled or directly influenced territory from Spain in the west to the borders of Russia in the east, from Denmark in the north to the southern tip of Italy. His brothers sat on the thrones of Spain, Naples, and Westphalia. His stepson ruled Italy. His allies and appointed kings governed much of the rest of continental Europe. He had put his family on half the thrones of Europe, and in every territory France controlled, the Napoleonic Code followed. Feudalism was abolished. The privileges of the old nobility were stripped away. Everyone was equal before the law, at least in theory. This was not just military conquest. This was the forced export of a revolution. The ideas that Napoleon carried with him, equality under law, religious tolerance, the dismantling of hereditary privilege, spread across Europe like cracks across old stone. Even after his empire fell, those ideas did not go away. But power at this scale comes with its own gravity. Napoleon was no longer just fighting defensive wars. He was fighting wars to hold what he had, and the more he had, the more he needed to protect. Britain remained unconquered. The British Navy was dominant, and Napoleon could not cross the Channel, so he tried to strangle Britain economically through what he called the Continental System, a blockade designed to cut off British trade with Europe. It caused serious problems for Britain, but it also caused problems for Napoleon. European merchants who depended on British goods resented the restrictions. Even France's own allies started cheating on the blockade. Portugal refused to comply. Spain was forced to comply and then revolted. And Russia, which had agreed to the system after a famous meeting between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander, on a raft in the middle of a river in 1807, eventually found the economic pain too great and quietly started trading with Britain again. Napoleon was furious. He decided to make an example of Russia, which turned out to be the worst decision of his life. In June 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with the Grande Armée, the largest invasion force Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 soldiers crossed the Russian border. The Russians did not fight him the way he expected. Instead of standing and being defeated in a decisive battle, they retreated and retreated and retreated further, drawing the French deeper into Russia, stretching their supply lines, letting the vast, cold land do the work. The French burned through food and water. Horses died by the thousands. Soldiers who fell behind were picked off by Russian raiders. Napoleon finally got his decisive battle at Borodino in September, a brutal, grinding fight that cost both sides enormous casualties. The Russians retreated again. Napoleon marched into Moscow. It was empty. The Russians had evacuated their own city and set it on fire. Napoleon sat in a burned Moscow for 35 days, waiting for Tsar Alexander to come and negotiate. Alexander never came. There was nothing left to do but retreat. And that retreat became one of the greatest disasters in military history. Winter came early and hit hard. Temperatures dropped to -30°C. Soldiers who had fought their way across Europe in uniforms designed for summer campaigns now froze to death in the Russian snow. They had nothing to eat. They burned their wagons for warmth. Russian cavalry and Cossacks harassed the columns constantly. Men died not just from cold and starvation, but from despair. They simply lay down in the snow and stopped moving. Of the 600,000 soldiers who entered Russia, roughly 100,000 made it home. 500,000 men, dead, prisoners, missing, gone. Napoleon returned to Paris ahead of his army, racing home to manage the political fallout before the scale of the disaster became clear. But the scale of the disaster was already clear to everyone else. After Russia, the coalition that Napoleon had broken so many times finally came together in a way that held. Prussia, which had been crushed at the Battle of Jena in 1806 and humiliated for years, rose up with a fury. Austria joined in. Russia was already coming. Sweden joined. Britain, as always, was funding everyone. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, known as the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced a combined army of over 300,000 soldiers. He fought brilliantly for 3 days with a force half that size, but still lost. He retreated back into France, and now the war was on French soil. For 4 months in early 1814, Napoleon fought what many historians consider his most creative campaign. With only a tiny, exhausted army, he used speed and mobility to defeat separate enemy columns in rapid succession, winning battle after battle against overwhelming odds. But there were too many of them. In April 1814, Paris fell. Napoleon's marshals, the men who had fought beside him for 20 years, told him it was over. They refused to continue. And on April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated the throne. He was allowed to keep the title of emperor, but only of Elba, a tiny island off the coast of Italy with a population of about 12,000 people. From the ruler of an empire of 70 million to the ruler of 12,000. He was 44 years old. He wept during the ceremony where he said goodbye to his old guard, the soldiers who had followed him everywhere. He told them he had wanted to kiss each of them. He embraced the flag. He was escorted to the coast. Most people assumed it was over. However, they did not know Napoleon. February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba. He landed on the French coast near Cannes with just over 1,000 men. The king who had been placed on the French throne, Louis XVIII, sent troops to stop him. When the troops met Napoleon on the road, he stepped forward alone, opened his coat, and spoke directly to them. "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, if any of you wishes to shoot his emperor, here I am." Not one of them fired. They joined him instead. More soldiers joined, then more, then more. Louis XVIII fled Paris. Napoleon walked in without firing a shot 20 days after landing in France. He was emperor again, but Europe was not going to let this stand. The coalition mobilized immediately. Napoleon knew he had to strike fast before the full Allied armies could assemble and coordinate. He moved north into Belgium, aiming to separate and destroy the British and Prussian armies before they could combine. He almost did it. At the Battle of Ligny on June 16th, he defeated the Prussians. But his pursuit was not aggressive enough, and the Prussians retreated in good order instead of being destroyed. 2 days later at Waterloo, Napoleon faced the British army under the Duke of Wellington. He attacked all day, but Wellington held. In the late afternoon, the Prussians arrived. They had not been destroyed at Ligny. They came from the side. Napoleon's army, already exhausted and depleted, could not hold. The French line broke. The retreat became a rout. Napoleon's last army dissolved. It was over. And this time, there would be no Elba. The British were taking no more chances. They sent Napoleon to Saint Helena, a volcanic island in the South Atlantic Ocean, almost 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. There was no escaping from Saint Helena. He was placed under the constant watch of a British governor named Hudson Lowe, a man Napoleon detested with every fibre of his being. He described Lowe as the worst man he had ever known. Lowe, for his part, followed his orders with a rigid precision that felt designed to humiliate. Napoleon was given a damp house that made him ill. His movements were restricted, his letters were read, his visitors were controlled. But Napoleon had one weapon left, his words. He began to dictate his memoirs. He spent hours a day shaping the story of his life for history, controlling the narrative of who he had been and what he had meant. He cast himself as the defender of the French Revolution and its ideals, as a champion of the common people against the old powers of Europe, as a man who had been misunderstood, surrounded, and ultimately betrayed. Was it true? Partly. Like all great storytellers, he understood that truth is something you can shape. He suffered from stomach pain that grew steadily worse over the years in Saint Helena. There has been debate ever since about whether he had stomach cancer, which is what the official reports said, or whether he was slowly being poisoned, deliberately or accidentally, by arsenic in the wallpaper dye of his damp house. We still do not know for certain. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died. He was 51 years old. His last words, according to those present, were, "France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine." The legacy here is the strange and remarkable thing about Napoleon Bonaparte. He lost. He was defeated, exiled, defeated again, and exiled to a rock in the ocean where he died at 51. And yet the world he left behind looked nothing like the world he found. The map of Europe had been redrawn. The old order of kings and nobles and churches, ruling by inherited right, had been cracked open. The idea that ordinary people had rights, that the law should apply equally to everyone, that talent and ability mattered more than the family you were born into, these ideas crossed Europe in the baggage train of Napoleon's armies. Even the countries that fought hardest against him came out changed on the other side. The Napoleonic Code. Many countries still use it as the basis of their legal systems. Think about that for a moment. Over 200 years later, when you go to court in France, in Belgium, in Louisiana, in Quebec, in dozens of countries across Latin America and the Middle East. The structure of the law you are operating inside traces back to a system Napoleon built when he was still in his early 30s. His administrative reforms, the prefect system he created to govern France's regions, still exist today. The Banque de France still exists. The lycée school system still exists. He built things meant to last. In military history, Napoleon's campaigns are still taught at West Point in America, at Sandhurst in Britain, at military academies in Russia, Germany, and China. Not just as history, as lessons. The idea of using mobility and speed to concentrate force at the enemy's weak point rather than simply smashing into their strength. The principle of living off the land to keep an army moving fast. The core system he used, which allowed different sections of an army to operate independently but come together for battle. These were his innovations, and they shaped how armies fought for more than a century after his death. Wellington, the man who defeated him at Waterloo, was asked years later who he thought was the greatest general in history. He said without hesitation, Napoleon. In 1840, 19 years after his death on Saint Helena, the French government brought Napoleon's body home. His remains were placed in a magnificent tomb at Les Invalides in Paris, a building that already housed the graves of France's military heroes. More than 1 million people lined the streets of Paris to watch the funeral procession go by, even though he had been dead for nearly 2 decades. His tomb is one of the most visited sites in France today. Every year, people from every country in the world stand around that sarcophagus made of red quartzite, a stone the color of old blood, and they think about what one human life can do to history. His story leaves us with a question. Was he the man who truly reshaped Europe through vision, or the man who destroyed millions for his ambition? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section.